The sun dipped low over Scottsdale, Arizona, casting a warm, golden light over the affluent suburban neighborhood of Paradise Ridge. Here, the streets were lined with carefully maintained houses, each one a symbol of success and stability. Lush gardens framed the homes, their flowers blooming in vibrant hues, and the lawns were neatly trimmed, reflecting the pride and care of the families who lived there. To anyone passing through, it was the kind of place where happiness and prosperity seemed not just possible but guaranteed. At the heart of this picturesque community lived Mary Thompson, a 75-year-old widow who had become something of a neighborhood fixture. Mary's life appeared to be the epitome of suburban perfection. Her stately house, set back from the road by a gravel path and shaded by a grand oak tree, was a beacon of traditional comfort. It was here she had raised her 2 children, hosted family gatherings, and built a life that many admired. To the outside world, Mary had it all: a loving family, a network of close friends, and a respected role as the leader of a local charity organization dedicated to supporting underprivileged women. Despite her age, Mary maintained an active social calendar, attending community events, volunteering, and regularly meeting her neighbors for tea or lunch. She was known for her sharp mind and elegant demeanor, traits that had made her one of the most well-regarded women in Paradise Ridge. Even though she had been widowed for 5 years, Mary carried the mantle of her late husband's legacy with grace, preserving his memory and continuing the philanthropic work they had started together. Her life, in many ways, was a tribute to the past they had built, a legacy of love, stability, and community service. But behind the facade of a life well lived, Mary was profoundly lonely. The loss of her husband, David, had created a void that nothing could quite fill. Their marriage had been a strong one filled with deep affection, mutual respect, and shared values. Together, they had navigated the trials of life, from raising their children to building a strong community presence. But when David passed away suddenly from a heart attack, Mary was left adrift. The structure of her days remained intact, but the substance of her life, the companionship, the sense of partnership, had vanished. Now, she found herself grappling with the long, quiet hours of the day, seeking something, anything, that might bring back a sense of meaning and connection. Though her children, Sarah and Alan, had encouraged her to move closer to them, Mary had resisted. Scottsdale had been her home for decades, and the thought of leaving the house that held so many memories was unbearable. Instead, she threw herself into her volunteer work and her fitness routine, using these activities as distractions from the deeper emptiness that gnawed at her. The neighbors saw a vibrant, engaged woman who had gracefully moved on after her loss. But beneath that composed exterior, Mary was restless, yearning for something she couldn't quite name. It was during this time that Mary joined an upscale gym in the area. Although she had never been particularly interested in fitness, the gym provided an escape from the oppressive quiet of her home. It became a new routine, a way to fill the hours that once stretched endlessly before her. Mary quickly found herself a part of the gym's culture, attending classes and making small talk with other members. She admired the younger women who came in daily, their toned bodies and endless energy a stark contrast to the frailty she sometimes felt creeping into her own bones. Here, in this world of youth and vitality, Mary could pretend, even if just for an hour, that she still belonged. Her regular presence at the gym didn't go unnoticed, especially by Kevin Davis, a 40-year-old fitness instructor who had recently started teaching classes. Kevin was everything Mary had forgotten she could be interested in: charming, energetic, and charismatic. He had an easygoing smile and an attentive nature that drew people to him. He made everyone, from young fitness enthusiasts to older clients like Mary, feel special and seen. As the weeks passed, Mary found herself lingering after classes, exchanging pleasantries with him that slowly grew into more personal conversations. At first, these interactions seemed harmless. Kevin would compliment Mary on her progress, noting how remarkable it was for a woman of her age to be so dedicated. He often offered her tips on improving her fitness routine, but as their conversations deepened, they began to drift away from exercise and into more personal topics. Kevin asked about her life, her family, and eventually her late husband. He was an attentive listener, which Mary hadn't experienced in years. She found herself confiding in him in ways she never thought she would, sharing stories about her loneliness and her longing for connection. While Mary had always prided herself on being emotionally self-sufficient, there was something about Kevin's attention that was intoxicating. She had spent so many years in the shadow of her grief, trying to be strong for her children and for her community, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed, to be appreciated as a woman, not just as a widow or a mother. Kevin's interest, however innocent it may have seemed at first, ignited something inside her, a long-dormant desire for companionship and excitement. The gym soon became more than just a place for exercise. It was a sanctuary, a place where Mary could escape the constraints of her well-ordered life. With each passing day, she found herself looking forward to her interactions with Kevin. Her mind, which had once been consumed by thoughts of loss and aging, now buzzed with the thrill of anticipation. She began dressing more carefully for her gym sessions, paying extra attention to her appearance in ways she hadn't since David had died. Her friends noticed the change, remarking on how vibrant she seemed, how she seemed to have found a new zest for life. They attributed it to her renewed focus on fitness, unaware of the deeper, more dangerous currents stirring beneath the surface. For the first time in years, Mary felt alive. But the closer she got to Kevin, the more precarious her position became. She was walking a fine line, balancing the image of the dignified widow with the mounting temptation to pursue something more with Kevin. The boundaries between what was appropriate and what wasn't began to blur, and Mary found herself contemplating actions she once would have never considered. The tension between her public persona and her private desires grew with each passing day. Outwardly, Mary was still the same woman who attended charity galas and led community meetings, but inside, a storm was brewing. She began to make small excuses to her family and friends, creating more opportunities to see Kevin alone. Her children remained unaware, absorbed in their own lives, while the neighborhood continued to see her as the poised, perfect woman she had always been. No one suspected that behind the closed doors of her elegant home, Mary was on the verge of unraveling a secret that could destroy everything she had worked so hard to maintain. As the weeks passed, what had begun as harmless conversations and casual flirtations with Kevin grew into something far more complex and far more dangerous. Mary's perfect suburban life, with its carefully constructed image of respectability and grace, was about to be shattered by a truth she could no longer keep hidden. The relationship between Mary Thompson and Kevin Davis began innocently enough, but it was rooted in needs neither of them were fully aware they had. For Mary, the gym had started as a simple escape from the suffocating quiet of her home. At 75 years old, she had already faced the significant challenge of losing her husband David after 50 years of marriage. With her children grown and busy with their own lives, she found herself living in a house full of memories but devoid of companionship. The gym, however, offered her structure, a place to go that filled the hollow hours of her days. Kevin Davis, her fitness instructor, was a man of stark contrasts. At 40, he was a full generation younger than Mary, yet his life was far from the stability she had known in her marriage. Kevin had grown up in a modest household and worked his way up through various jobs before becoming a fitness instructor at the upscale gym where he and Mary met. His life was a patchwork of short-term relationships, financial struggles, and fleeting moments of professional success. His charm and good looks had always been his saving grace, allowing him to slide through life on the goodwill of others. When Kevin first noticed Mary, it wasn't because of her wealth or status, but rather her consistency. She was one of the few older clients who regularly showed up to the gym, committed to her routine, and always polite. To Kevin, she represented a kind of discipline and grace that he rarely encountered among his other clients. Mary was never demanding or overly concerned with appearances. She came to the gym quietly, always dressed neatly, but without the vanity of younger women who obsessed over every wrinkle or sagging muscle. Kevin, always on the lookout for new opportunities, saw Mary as someone with whom he could develop a rapport. As a fitness instructor, he had learned that clients often crave more than just physical training. They wanted attention, connection, even a bit of validation. With Mary, it started with simple gestures, encouraging words during a workout, subtle compliments on her progress, or lingering smiles after their sessions. These small moments, though harmless on the surface, began to draw Mary in. Mary, who hadn't felt noticed in years, started to respond to Kevin's attention in ways she hadn't expected. At first, she told herself it was simply nice to be appreciated, that she was just enjoying the company of a friendly instructor. After all, wasn't it normal for people to connect at the gym? But soon, those interactions began to occupy her thoughts more than she would have liked to admit. Kevin was charismatic, confident, and attentive in ways that felt intoxicating to a woman who had spent the last few years in the shadows of grief. The lines between a professional relationship and something more personal blurred over time. Kevin began sharing more about his life, his financial struggles, his aspirations beyond fitness, and his frustrations with the hand life had dealt him. His openness created an emotional bond between them that Mary hadn't experienced in years. For her, it was as though she had been asleep for a long time, And now, in Kevin's presence, she was waking up again. For Kevin, there was a transactional nature to his growing attachment to Mary, though he would never admit it to himself. He wasn't consciously using her for her wealth, but he couldn't help but notice the privileges her life afforded her. Mary lived in a grand house, drove a luxury car, and moved in social circles that Kevin could only dream of entering. The possibility of benefiting from her influence and resources was always in the back of his mind, shaping his behavior in subtle ways. He wasn't immune to the appeal of her status, even if his initial attraction had been more about the validation she gave him than anything material. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent and less confined to the gym. Mary started finding excuses to linger after her workouts, perhaps to discuss a new fitness goal or to ask for advice on her routine. Kevin, always obliging, offered her more time, and soon their conversations drifted from fitness to more personal matters, family, memories, and the quiet pains they both carried. Kevin was quick to flatter, telling Mary how remarkable she was for staying active and engaged at her age, how much he admired her discipline. Mary, in turn, found herself opening up about her past, sharing stories of her late husband and the loneliness she had tried to keep at bay. Without either of them fully realizing it, their relationship had moved beyond the casual rapport between a client and an instructor. Kevin had become someone Mary looked forward to seeing, someone who made her feel young again. He was attentive in ways that brought back memories of the early days of her marriage, when David had been as energetic and engaged as Kevin now seemed to be. But as much as Mary enjoyed the attention, she began to feel a growing sense of guilt. It was one thing to talk to Kevin at the gym, but the way she thought about him afterward, the way her heart fluttered when she saw him, those were things she couldn't easily explain away. Kevin, on the other hand, was becoming more aware of the control he had over Mary's emotions. He wasn't cold or calculating, but he recognized how much she enjoyed his company and how her demeanor changed when they were together. He started testing boundaries, inviting her to coffee after workouts, suggesting they take walks to discuss her fitness progress, and offering to help her with errands. These gestures, while still innocent on the surface, carried the weight of unspoken intentions. Kevin wasn't blind to the dynamic unfolding between them. He knew that Mary was drawn to him in ways that went beyond friendship. As the relationship deepened, Mary became more invested in Kevin's life. She offered him advice on his finances, shared connections she thought might help him, and even hinted that she could assist him more directly if he needed it. Kevin, always careful not to push too far too quickly, played the role of the humble, grateful friend, insisting that he didn't want to burden her. Yet the more she offered, the more he found himself drawn to the idea of a life where Mary could provide him with things he had never had access to before. For Mary, the guilt of their growing bond was compounded by the sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't right. She was an older woman, a widow, and Kevin was a man much younger than her. Yet the thrill of it all, the attention, the feeling of being wanted, was addictive. She began rationalizing her actions, telling herself that it wasn't as if they were doing anything wrong. There had been no physical contact, no declarations of love or passion. But the truth was, the boundaries had already been crossed long ago. Mary's emotional investment in Kevin was undeniable, and though she tried to keep it hidden, the changes in her behavior did not go unnoticed by those closest to her. Her daughter, Sarah, began to sense something different in her mother. Mary, who had once been so focused on family gatherings and community events, now seemed more distracted, more secretive. She had a new energy, a brightness that seemed to come out of nowhere. Sarah chalked it up to the gym and her mother's newfound interest in fitness. But there were other signs as well. Mary was spending more money than usual, buying new clothes, and frequently mentioning Kevin in passing. Sarah wasn't the only one to notice these changes, but no one dared to question Mary directly. After all, what harm could a simple friendship with a gym instructor do? What none of them knew was that the relationship between Mary and Kevin was on the brink of turning into something far more complicated. The emotional affair that had begun with innocent conversations was now teetering on the edge of becoming physical. The tension between them, though unspoken, was growing, and both Mary and Kevin felt it. They were playing with fire, and deep down, both of them knew it was only a matter of time before the line they had been so carefully dancing around would be crossed. Mary's perfect suburban life, with its structured routines and carefully maintained appearances, was beginning to unravel. What had started as an innocent distraction was transforming into a dangerous affair, one that threatened to expose the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. She was no longer just the dignified widow of Paradise Ridge. She was a woman caught in the throes of temptation, desperate to feel alive again, even if it meant risking everything. As Mary Thompson's relationship with Kevin Davis deepened, the sense of guilt that had quietly gnawed at her began to evolve into something more complicated. What had once been an innocent attraction, a harmless emotional connection, had grown into a tangled web of deceit that spread across all aspects of her life. With each new encounter, Mary found herself falling deeper into a situation she had never imagined for herself, a life where lies became her only means of survival. The initial excitement Mary had felt when Kevin began paying attention to her was intoxicating. He had revived a part of her she thought had withered with age and the loss of her husband. But now, as the weeks turned into months, the exhilaration was tinged with unease. The affair had remained, in many ways, emotional, hovering in the gray area between companionship and something more, but the boundaries between right and wrong had long since blurred. What was once a harmless friendship had turned into a secret that weighed heavily on Mary's mind. In the beginning, the lies were small. Mary started making excuses to her children, particularly her daughter Sarah, about her sudden absences. "I'm just going to the gym" became a common refrain, a simple way to justify the hours she spent with Kevin. At first, this was true. They met during her workouts or shortly afterward, grabbing coffee or taking long walks. But soon, the time they spent together extended far beyond her gym routine. Kevin began asking her for favors, small, seemingly insignificant requests that grew in complexity over time. It started with Mary buying him little things: a protein shake here, a new workout shirt there. These gestures, though financially insignificant to her, became habitual. Kevin had a way of making her feel needed, subtly reminding her how much he appreciated her generosity. What was once a harmless gift soon turned into something more substantial. Kevin, whose financial situation was precarious, began mentioning his struggles more frequently. He was behind on rent, his car needed repairs, and his bills were piling up. Each time he spoke about his hardships, Mary felt a pang of responsibility. She had the means to help him, after all. It was only right that she should offer some assistance. And so she did. At first, it was a few $100s here and there under the guise of a loan, though they both knew it would never be repaid. Kevin never asked outright, but his subtle hints were enough to sway Mary. She rationalized her actions, telling herself that she was simply helping a friend in need. It was only money, after all, and she had more than enough. But the lies began to compound. To cover her tracks, Mary found herself withdrawing money in small amounts, careful not to raise suspicion. She fabricated reasons for the sudden expenses, explaining away her new spending habits to her family and friends with ease. "Just a little home renovation," she would say, or "I'm treating myself to something nice." The excuses worked. For a while. Her daughter Sarah, however, began to notice a shift in her mother's behavior. Sarah had always been close to Mary, especially after the passing of her father. But recently her mother seemed distant. There was a new secretiveness to her that Sarah couldn't quite place. Mary was less involved in family gatherings, often distracted during conversations, and increasingly elusive about her daily activities. When Sarah asked where she had been or what she had been up to, Mary's answers were vague, and the topic was quickly changed. It was unlike her mother, who had always been open and transparent. Meanwhile, Kevin's requests escalated. What had once been small financial favors turned into larger asks. His rent was overdue by months, and he faced eviction. His car was on the brink of breaking down, and he needed repairs that would cost thousands. Kevin, always charming and persuasive, played on Mary's emotions, reminding her of how much he valued her support, how no one else in his life cared for him the way she did. Each time Mary hesitated, knowing that giving in to his demands would dig her deeper into a situation that was spiraling out of control. But her desire to keep him close, to maintain the connection she had with him, overpowered her better judgment. In addition to the money, Kevin began relying on Mary for emotional support, confiding in her about every aspect of his life. He vented about his failed relationships, his financial hardships, and his frustration with the world. Mary, who had always been a nurturing figure, found herself becoming his emotional anchor. But the more Kevin leaned on her, the more trapped she felt. His dependence on her was suffocating, yet she couldn't bring herself to sever the relationship. In many ways, Kevin had become her lifeline, a source of excitement and validation in a life that had otherwise become dull and routine. To maintain the facade of her normal life, Mary began lying to more than just her family. Her friends, particularly those in her social circles and charity organizations, started to ask questions as well. Mary, once so dedicated to her community work, had begun neglecting her responsibilities. She missed meetings, failed to follow through on commitments, and seemed distracted when she did attend events. Her absence was noticed, but no one dared to confront her directly. They chalked it up to her age, perhaps assuming that she was slowing down or still grieving the loss of her husband. But Mary knew the truth. She was too preoccupied with Kevin, with the lies she had spun to keep their relationship hidden. As the web of lies grew more intricate, so did Mary's sense of isolation. She could no longer turn to her children for support, not without risking the exposure of her affair with Kevin. She distanced herself from her friends, afraid that they might see through her carefully constructed veneer of composure. Even her once regular conversations with her late husband's memory grew strained, as guilt gnawed at her conscience. She felt as though she were living a double life, one as the beloved widow, respected by her community, and the other as a woman entangled in a dangerous relationship she couldn't control. Mary's mental state began to fray under the pressure. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, as she replayed the lies she had told throughout the day. The fear of being found out, of losing everything she had worked so hard to protect, loomed over her constantly. She began to avoid answering her phone when her children called, unable to face the possibility of their suspicions. In public, she wore a mask of calm and poise, but inside, she was unraveling. Kevin, for his part, seemed oblivious to the toll the affair was taking on Mary. He continued to push her for more money, more time, more attention. His demands were relentless, and Mary, unable to refuse him, continued to comply. Yet with each new favor, her resentment grew. She hated herself for being so weak, for letting him control her life. But more than that, she hated the situation. She had created a life built on lies, with no way to escape. The lies began to seep into every part of Mary's existence. She found herself fabricating stories even when she didn't need to, spinning falsehoods to cover her tracks, to justify her actions to herself. It became a reflex, a way of navigating the increasingly complicated maze of her life. But the more she lied, the more trapped she felt, and the more she realized that there was no easy way out. As the months went by, Mary's web of lies grew too large to maintain. The delicate balance she had created between her public life and her secret relationship with Kevin was starting to collapse under its own weight. She was constantly on edge, afraid that one wrong move, one slip of the tongue, would bring everything crashing down around her. And deep down, she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth emerged, shattering the perfect life she had worked so hard to build. As the relationship between Mary Thompson and Kevin Davis deepened, what had once been an exciting connection turned into a consuming obsession. Mary, now entirely enmeshed in the affair, found her thoughts dominated by Kevin in ways she had never anticipated. She was no longer just seeking companionship. Her desire for him had grown into something far more intense, even dangerous. The boundaries between affection and obsession became blurred, and the emotional dependency that had begun innocently now threatened to overtake her life. For Mary, Kevin represented an escape from the stagnation she had felt since her husband's death. He was not just a distraction but a lifeline to a version of herself she thought had long disappeared, a woman who was vibrant, desired, and full of life. This feeling of renewal had become addictive, and Mary found herself clinging to it desperately. Her days revolved around Kevin, when they would meet, what they would talk about, and how she could keep his attention. She began to crave his presence in a way that was almost suffocating. Each moment away from him felt like an eternity, and she constantly sought ways to stay in contact, whether through texts, calls, or planning their next meeting. Kevin, however, was beginning to feel the weight of the relationship. Initially flattered by Mary's affection and generosity, he now felt cornered by her growing demands on his time and attention. What started as a flirtatious relationship that benefited him financially was becoming burdensome. He had not anticipated how deeply Mary would fall for him, nor had he foreseen how dependent she would become. The small favors he once accepted without hesitation, money for bills, new clothes, or rent, now came with unspoken expectations. It was clear that Mary wanted more from him than just companionship. She was no longer content with occasional meetings. She wanted a deeper connection, and Kevin felt increasingly trapped. Mary's obsession manifested in subtle but significant changes to her routine. She started ignoring her other commitments, especially her charity work and social obligations, all in favor of spending time with Kevin. Her once orderly life became chaotic. She neglected household chores, failed to return calls from friends, and even distanced herself from her children. Every thought was consumed by how to keep Kevin engaged, how to prevent him from slipping away. She feared losing the one person who made her feel alive again, and this fear drove her to make increasingly irrational decisions. To maintain Kevin's interest, Mary became more indulgent. She offered him more money, expensive gifts, and even talked about investing in a business he had always wanted to start. Kevin, though uncomfortable with her growing dependency, continued to accept her offers, unable to resist the financial support she provided. But the more he accepted, the deeper Mary's obsession grew. She saw her financial contributions not as transactions but as proof of their bond, believing that the more she gave, the more Kevin would need her. As her fixation on Kevin intensified, so did her paranoia. Mary became convinced that Kevin might find someone younger, someone more suited to his age and lifestyle. The idea of losing him was unbearable, and it began to affect her behavior. She questioned him constantly about his whereabouts, who he was spending time with, and whether he was seeing other women. Though Kevin tried to reassure her, his patience was wearing thin. He had not signed up for this level of emotional entanglement, and the constant questioning and emotional intensity were beginning to take their toll. Mary's obsession also began to reveal itself in her actions toward others. She grew increasingly possessive of Kevin, and anyone who seemed to come between them was viewed as a threat. Her relationship with her daughter Sarah, already strained by the secrecy surrounding her affair, grew even more tense. Mary resented the time she spent with Sarah, seeing it as time she could be spending with Kevin. She started avoiding family gatherings altogether, unwilling to be away from him for long stretches of time. Sarah noticed the shift and became even more suspicious, but Mary shut her out completely, unwilling to answer any questions about what was really going on. Kevin's discomfort with the situation reached a peak when Mary began talking about their future together in more serious terms. She hinted at the possibility of moving in with him, even going so far as to suggest that they might relocate to a different city, where they could start fresh. Kevin, already feeling overwhelmed by her emotional demands, realized that Mary's feelings had far surpassed his own. He didn't want a future with her. He had never seen their relationship as more than a temporary escape. The realization that Mary was planning a life together, based on the relationship he had seen as fleeting, filled him with dread. Mary, oblivious to Kevin's growing discomfort, continued to push for more. Her obsession had blinded her to the reality of the situation. She began to justify her actions, telling herself that she was giving Kevin what he needed, that they were meant to be together. The more Kevin pulled away, the more desperate she became. She started showing up at his apartment unannounced, calling him repeatedly, and leaving gifts at his doorstep when he wasn't home. Kevin's attempts to distance himself only fueled her fears that she was losing him, pushing her to cling even tighter. As Mary's behavior became more erratic, Kevin started considering how to extricate himself from the situation. He hadn't intended for things to go this far, and he knew that continuing the relationship would only lead to more complications. But he also feared what might happen if he ended things abruptly. Mary's emotional state had become so fragile, and he worried that rejecting her outright might provoke an extreme reaction. He wasn't sure what she was capable of, but he sensed that her obsession was deepening to a dangerous level. The tipping point came when Mary, in a moment of desperation, began to see Kevin not just as her lover but as the solution to all her problems. The relationship, which had started as an escape from her loneliness, now represented her entire world. She couldn't imagine life without Kevin, and the thought of losing him filled her with a sense of impending doom. She began entertaining darker thoughts, considering the lengths she might go to in order to keep him by her side. In her mind, Kevin was the key to her happiness, and she was willing to do whatever it took to preserve their bond, even if it meant crossing lines she had never before considered. The more she thought about it, the more her fixation on controlling the situation grew. Kevin wasn't just a man anymore, he was her lifeline, the anchor that kept her from sinking into the abyss of grief and loneliness that had consumed her since her husband's death. And if she couldn't have him, no one else could either. This thought, initially fleeting and terrifying, began to take root in her mind. Mary's obsession had transformed from longing and desire into something far more dangerous, a possessive need that was quickly spiraling out of control. In her increasingly unhinged state, Mary started to consider drastic actions. The thought of losing Kevin, the one person who made her feel alive again, became unbearable. She wasn't ready to let go, not now, not ever. And so in the dark corners of her mind, a plan began to form, one that would ensure Kevin stayed with her, no matter the cost. What had started as an affair had now evolved into a dangerous game, one that neither Mary nor Kevin could control, and one that was hurtling toward a devastating conclusion. As Mary Thompson's obsession with Kevin Davis deepened, her desperation to keep him by her side began to take on a more sinister edge. What had started as a whirlwind affair, one that revived in her a sense of passion and purpose, had become a toxic entanglement of dependency and possessiveness. Mary, who had once prided herself on her rationality and control, found those qualities slipping away as she clung more fiercely to Kevin. The fear of losing him consumed her thoughts, and she began to see everyone, even her own family, as threats to their relationship. But there was one threat in particular that stood out: her estranged son, Alan. Alan had returned to Scottsdale after several years of distance from the family. His past struggles with addiction and their subsequent fallout had strained his relationship with Mary and his sister Sarah. He had recently started rebuilding his life, but his presence in Scottsdale unsettled Mary. Alan was the only person in her family who seemed suspicious of her affair with Kevin. Though he never confronted her directly, Mary could feel his judgment in the way he looked at her, in his probing questions about her time and money. Unlike Sarah, who was preoccupied with her own life, Alan was more perceptive and less easily fooled. This made him a danger. As Mary's obsession with Kevin spiraled out of control, she became increasingly paranoid that Alan would discover the full extent of her relationship with Kevin and expose her. She saw him as the one person who could ruin everything: her reputation, her family's respect, and most importantly, her connection to Kevin. In her mind, if Alan wasn't in the picture, things would be simpler. Kevin wouldn't have to worry about his own safety, and Mary would no longer feel the constant threat of her secret being uncovered. Kevin, too, had grown uneasy about Alan. Though he wasn't as emotionally invested in the relationship as Mary, he understood how precarious their situation had become. Alan's presence was a complication neither of them could afford. Kevin feared that if Alan dug too deeply into Mary's financial affairs, he might uncover the money Mary had been funneling to him. Kevin had his own secrets to protect, and the last thing he needed was for Alan to start asking questions about why his mother's bank accounts had been drained of significant sums over the past several months. Mary and Kevin's conversations increasingly revolved around Alan. At first, they discussed harmless ways to keep him at a distance, perhaps by convincing Sarah to talk to him or by making him feel unwelcome in Scottsdale. But as time passed, Mary's suggestions became darker, more extreme. The strain of keeping her affair secret, combined with her growing dependence on Kevin, pushed her toward thoughts she would never have entertained before. She began to frame Alan not as her son, but as an obstacle, one that, if removed, could solve all of her problems. The idea of getting rid of Alan first surfaced in Mary's mind as a fleeting, horrifying thought. But as her paranoia and desperation mounted, the idea began to take root, slowly growing into a fully formed plan. She imagined how peaceful her life could be without Alan constantly questioning her decisions, without the threat of him discovering her affair with Kevin. It wasn't just about self-preservation anymore, it was about securing a future with Kevin, free from the prying eyes of her son. Mary's thoughts became consumed with how to make Alan disappear. She started researching ways to make it look like an accident, or perhaps a relapse into his old habits. Given Alan's history with addiction, it wouldn't be difficult to frame his death as an overdose, something tragic but believable. Mary told herself that she wasn't really killing her son, she was just speeding up the inevitable, given Alan's fragile sobriety and history. It was a lie she repeated to herself so often that she started to believe it. Kevin, though initially horrified by Mary's suggestion, found himself reluctantly drawn into her plan. He had always known that their relationship was fraught with risk, but this was different. Murder wasn't something he had ever imagined, and yet Mary's manipulation was subtle and persistent. She played on his fears, reminding him of how Alan's presence endangered them both. She painted Alan as an inevitable threat, someone who could ruin both of their lives. Kevin, desperate to avoid confrontation and increasingly anxious about the consequences of their affair, eventually capitulated to Mary's dark logic. The plan they concocted was simple but effective. Alan, who had struggled with addiction in the past, would be easy to frame for a relapse. Mary had access to his medical history and knew the substances he had abused during his lowest points. They decided that Kevin would procure the drugs enough to overdose Alan, but in a way that would make it look accidental. Mary knew how to manipulate the circumstances to make it appear as though Alan had fallen back into his old habits. She would plant stories among family members and friends, expressing concern over his well-being in the weeks leading up to his death, making it seem as though the relapse had been building for some time. Kevin would deliver the drugs, while Mary would ensure that Alan was alone and vulnerable when it happened. They decided on a night when Alan was supposed to visit Mary at her house. she would offer him a drink laced with a sedative to weaken him, making him less likely to resist. Then, once he was incapacitated, Kevin would arrive to inject him with the drugs that would lead to a fatal overdose. The scene would be staged carefully, with evidence of drug use scattered around the room. It would appear tragic, but ultimately unsuspicious, a son who had tragically fallen back into his old ways. The more they discussed the plan, the more detached Mary became from the reality of what she was about to do. She no longer saw Alan as her son. He had become a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized. In her obsession with Kevin, she had twisted her perception of Alan, framing his death as necessary for the preservation of the life she so desperately wanted. She convinced herself that she was acting out of self-defense, that Alan's death would be better for everyone, himself included. After all, hadn't he suffered enough? Wasn't it inevitable that he would fall back into addiction eventually? Kevin, for his part, knew deep down that what they were planning was wrong, but Mary's relentless manipulation wore him down. He convinced himself that he had no other choice, that Alan's death would protect them both. He was terrified of the consequences if Alan discovered their affair or the money Mary had given him. The thought of prison or losing everything he had built for himself drove him to follow through with Mary's plan, even though it filled him with dread. On the night they had chosen, Mary prepared herself mentally for what was to come. She had rehearsed the events in her mind over and over, convincing herself that it was the only way forward. When Alan arrived at her house, she greeted him as usual, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She poured him a drink, as she had done many times before, only this time it was laced with the sedative that would render him helpless. As they sat together, Mary forced herself to smile and engage in casual conversation, all the while knowing that in just a few short hours her son would be dead. When Alan started to feel the effects of the drug, Mary knew it was time. She called Kevin, who had been waiting nearby, and within minutes he arrived at the house. Alan, barely conscious, was too weak to resist as Kevin injected him with the lethal dose of drugs. Mary watched, numb, as her son's body went limp, his breathing slowing until it stopped altogether. In the aftermath, Mary and Kevin worked quickly to stage the scene. They scattered drug paraphernalia around the room, wiping down any surfaces they had touched. Mary made sure to leave Alan's phone and belongings in a way that suggested he had been alone all night. When they were finished, they left the house, confident that they had covered their tracks. But as Mary walked away, a chilling realization settled over her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The web of lies and manipulation had now led to murder, and no amount of rationalization could change that. In the aftermath of Alan's death, Mary Thompson and Kevin Davis believed they had covered their tracks well enough to avoid suspicion. The scene they had staged painted a clear picture of a relapse, a tragic end for a man with a history of addiction. Alan's death was initially ruled as an accidental overdose, and the community mourned him as another victim of the struggles that had plagued his life. Mary, outwardly grief-stricken, played the part of the devastated mother, while inside, a sense of relief quietly bloomed. She believed that her son's death had removed the greatest threat to her relationship with Kevin, and for a brief moment it seemed as though life would go back to normal. But the consequences of their actions were far-reaching and swift. Alan's death, though staged to look like a relapse, raised subtle red flags for those who knew him well. His recent efforts to rebuild his life, the fact that he had been sober for years, and his distance from the lifestyle that once ensnared him made his sudden overdose difficult for some to believe. Sarah, Alan's sister, was especially unconvinced. She had noticed the growing strangeness in their mother's behavior over the past months and had long suspected something was wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. The police, too, began to have doubts. An investigation was reopened after forensic experts discovered small discrepancies in the crime scene details that didn't quite align with the profile of an accidental overdose. Traces of the sedative Mary had given Alan, combined with the precise manner of drug injection, pointed to foul play. As the investigation deepened, Kevin's name surfaced through phone records and financial transactions that linked him to Mary in ways that couldn't be explained by a simple friendship. When detectives uncovered the significant sums of money Mary had been withdrawing over the past several months, it became clear that something more sinister had taken place. Kevin, already racked with guilt, began to crumble under the pressure of the investigation. His fear of being caught, compounded by Mary's increasing demands and the weight of their shared crime, drove him to make a critical mistake. When confronted by detectives, he broke down, confessing his role in Alan's death and pointing to Mary as the mastermind behind the plan. Kevin's confession unraveled everything, exposing the twisted relationship and the deadly plot that had led to Alan's murder. Mary, confronted with the evidence in Kevin's betrayal, found herself trapped. The lies she had built her life around came crashing down, and with them, her carefully constructed facade. Her community, once full of admiration for her, turned against her as the truth emerged. Mary's obsession with Kevin, her fear of losing control, and her willingness to destroy her own son in the process shocked everyone who had known her. The trial that followed was brief but devastating. Mary was convicted of first-degree murder, while Kevin was sentenced for his role in the crime. Both received lengthy prison sentences, ensuring that neither would escape the consequences of their actions. Sarah, left to pick up the pieces of her broken family, was haunted by the knowledge that her mother's obsession had driven her to commit the unthinkable. In the end, Mary's desperate attempt to preserve her relationship with Kevin had cost her everything: her son, her freedom, and her reputation. The tragedy of Alan's death was not just in the act itself, but in how it revealed the darkness lurking beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect life Mary had once lived.